Afternoon and welcome to the Wilson China Fellowship Conference. My name is Charles Kraus and I'm the Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, one of the co-sponsors of today's program. It's my privilege to moderate this discussion on the Chinese authoritarian model and its global impact with three very accomplished speakers. Under Xi Jinping, several trends, including technological advancements in surveillance and big data, an institutional strengthening of the CCP, and a growing authoritarianism have converged to witness a more aggressive approach to domestic security in places such as Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. Elsewhere in the world, China has begun exporting its suite of surveillance technologies to numerous countries throughout the world, an initiative that triggers some concerns about negative impacts on democracy and governance. What does this approach to domestic security and surveillance mean for the international system? What does this issue indicate for the future of China and its relationships with other powers? To consider these and other related questions, we are fortunate to have three expert speakers, all of whom are members of the first cohort of the Wilson China Fellowship. And allow me to introduce them briefly. So our first speaker will be Dr. Darren Byler, who is an anthropologist presently affiliated with the Center for Asia Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder as a postdoctoral fellow. Dr. Byler is also an incoming assistant professor at Simon Fraser University and one of the foremost experts on China's contemporary policies towards the Uyghurs and other Muslim communities of the region commonly known as Xinjiang. Dr. Byler earned his doctorate from the University of Washington and is a prolific writer on issues related to contemporary Xinjiang with numerous publications in academic journals, edited volumes, and in popular online outlets like SupChina. He is currently at work on a book manuscript titled Terror, Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession, and Masculine Violence in a Chinese City. Dr. Byler will be speaking today on Chinese technologies of population management on the New Silk Road. Following Dr. Byler, we will hear from Dr. Alexander Dukalskis, an associate professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University College Dublin. Dr. Dukalskis earned a dual PhD in political science and peace studies from the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of the 2017 book, The Authoritarian Public Sphere, Legitimation and Autocratic Power in North Korea, Burma, and China, and many articles in leading academic journals. He is currently at work at a second book project for Oxford University Press on how authoritarian states try to make themselves look good in the eyes of foreign audiences. And we will hear from him on authoritarian image management and PRC advertorials and foreign publications. And last but not certainly least, we are fortunate to have Dr. Sheena Chestnut Greitens on the panel. Dr. Greitens is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, having recently arrived there after several years at the University of Missouri. She holds appointments and affiliations with the Brookings Institution, CSIS, Harvard University, and the Center for New American Security. Dr. Greitens is the author of the award-winning book, Dictators and Their Secret Police, published by Cambridge in 2016, as well as many articles in academic journals and edited volumes in English, Chinese, and Korean, and in major media outlets. Dr. Greitens will talk today about assessing the global impact of Chinese surveillance technology. Each of our speakers will present for between 10 to 20 minutes, and then we will move into a discussion with our audience. We will be accepting questions through Twitter and through email. So please submit your questions by tagging @AsiaProgram on Twitter or by sending an email to asia@wilsoncenter.org. Again, that's @AsiaProgram on Twitter or asia@wilsoncenter.org. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation when submitting your question. So we'll turn it over to Darren Byler to start things off. Darren, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Chuck. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all for tuning in and your interest in this topic. What my report for the Wilson Center looks at is thousands of unredacted internal police files from Urumqi, which is the capital city of Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Northwest China. This data set is drawn from a larger data set of around 52 gigabytes that was obtained by an investigative reporter named Yale Grauer at the journal The Intercept. So I've been looking at these files for the last year, really trying to understand the capacities and goals of the policing system in Northwest China, and looking at surveillance capacities in particular, their effects, who they're trying to target, and then thinking broadly in a broader way about how these things can travel to other places, what makes the Xinjiang system unique. So in my 15 minutes or so, I'll talk about 5 of the findings that I come to in the report, and then go through some of the implications. So the first finding is that the reports from the Mobile Police Network, which is an app-based, smartphone-based system that's being used by police and police contractors, by civil servants, all sponsored by the Urumqi Public Security Bureau, that those reports are skewed dramatically towards Muslims. More than 84% of the reports focus on Muslim minorities. And this is important because Urumqi is actually a minority Muslim city. Like, most of the people in Urumqi are Han, but only 16% of the reports focus on the Han population, though they make up 71% of the city's population. So there's a real of the police data, of these reports, of the police vision towards these minority people. That's a fairly obvious conclusion, but it's great to have concrete data that shows this, spanning thousands of these internal reports. Finding number 2 is that surveillance infrastructure is being used to capture Muslim social institutions. Capture and transform. And what I mean by that is it's really changing the function of these institutions, in some cases almost eliminating them. Dozens of reports indicate that imams have been detained or been transferred, while some mosques remain open, mostly the large, what they call Friday mosques. While the smaller neighborhood mosques have been demolished. The people that are actually going into those mosques that are remaining open have dropped really precipitously. What the reports show is that in the first 4 months of 2018, there was a drop of 96.52% in people attending the mosque, as compared to 2017, which is when 80,000 people attended a mosque. They said that now at this one particular mosque, only 167 people are still attending the mosque, and they are all elderly, and they all have household registration in the city. And so they weren't worried about this 167 elderly people going to the mosque anymore. The reports frame this process as a success. This is what the policing is intended to do, is to stop people from going to the mosque. And so halting Islamic activity is one of the goals. And they say that there's 6 factors associated with stopping this attendance. The first is demolition of migrant housing in the area around the mosque. And along with that, expelling of the migrant population of Uyghurs in the city to southern Xinjiang, which we know from other research that I've done and others have done, that when people return to their villages, they're often detained and then sent to camps. This is the site where there's this massive internment camp system. Along with demolition and expelling populations, there's probably the more important factor is a real name checkpoint system that's been installed at the entrance to the mosque, where people have to scan their ID and then it's matched to their face. So there's this face scan checkpoint. And in addition to this, the report says that there's been a drop in the, quote, actual population of the district due to the detentions of former attendees of the mosque. So many people have been sent to the camps that the population itself has been reduced. They also say that in association with that checkpoint system, religious people are now afraid to pray in the mosque because, and here I'm quoting directly, they have been told that those enter the mosque more than 200 times, who show up in that checkpoint system more than 200 times, will be sent to education. So there's a kind of a quota of how many times you can go into the mosque before you're sent to the camp. And this is at least a widely held belief and something that has been told to the population. The police also reported that they discovered no instances of people conducting, quote unquote, illegal prayers at home or in any other unauthorized place. And this is because it's widely known, everyone knows this, that this is another violation that can lead to detention. So the mosque itself is being targeted. That's one of the things that this report shows. It also shows that family structure, which is another social institution for Uyghurs, for any society, is being targeted. In approximately 1 out of every 15 adult Uyghur, Kazakh, and Hui people are in detention in Urumqi. This is, looking at several different sites and comparing them. It could, in some cases, there's more than 1 in 15, but this is a general sort of rule. Approximately 73% of adult ethnic minority population members have been assessed during a given week. And this is in 2018 and 19. As many as 50% have their phones scanned in a given week. And as many as 25% have home visits during a given week. That 25% is typically the relatives of people that are in the camps or in prison. So there's just really detailed data in this data set. And a lot of what I'm seeing and describing to you is actually things that are just confirming previous reports, but giving it a lot more sort of granular evidence. The third finding is that the system depends on human labor. Much of the technology system is implemented by civil servants in neighborhood watch units, or we call them community centers, the shachu. And along with that, there's low-level police assistants, or xiejing, that have been hired to act as proxies for the state and the surveillance system. So they're actually technicians of the surveillance system. They're implementing it, sorting the population, making sure the scans are being done correctly. We know from other research that around 90,000 new security personnel have been hired in the region. And we also know that over 1 million civil servants, or in some cases, government employees, have been tasked with volunteering, and this is a sort of a coercive volunteering process, to begin to surveil people in their homes. The fourth finding is that political ideology is a key feature of the system. Flag raising ceremonies are something that, and political education are something that show up over and over again in the reports. Something that is done on typically a Monday, where people go out and raise the flag, sing the national anthem, and then listen to people vowing their loyalty to the state, and then also political speeches. In one of the reports, they talk about the leaders of the local community unit going to the cinema to watch a movie called Operation Red Sea, which is a blockbuster film, a mainstream blockbuster film that was widely watched throughout China, that focuses on Chinese counterterrorism operations in the Middle East, in Yemen. They say that watching this film helped to reaffirm their resolve to fight terrorism. And they talked about how they now need to host like neighborhood watch parties, where they would go and watch this film together with the community, to sort of show the efforts that are in place to fight terrorism. Really, what I'm seeing in the data is a sort of a rise of a counterterrorism fever, a kind of campaign that's organized and orchestrated, that everyone is buying into. They also talk about providing comfort to the relatives of the detainees by explaining to them that this is in their best interest, that their family will be better off in the long term if their relative is re-educated. And they talk about monitoring and evaluating the thinking of people who are on watch lists. So there's this ideology work that's being done. The fifth finding is that state coercion is a strong element throughout the entire system at all levels. So the people that are conducting the surveillance work are also being monitored. They're looking for forms of deviance, the rhetoric of being two-faced, of affirming the system in public, but privately having reservations, is something that's mentioned over and over again as something that should be guarded against. So you can see very clearly that there's a quota system that's in place for collecting intelligence, and there's incentives and also punishments for deviating from the structures of the system. All right, so what are some of the implications of all of this? some aspects of the system, the technology system, have already spread to other places in China. That's clear. In fact, many of them actually came from other places in China to Xinjiang. What is different in Xinjiang and unique to it is the density of the surveillance system. The checkpoints are so regular. There's so many overlaid cameras and other forms of assessment that are in place, and you don't find those to the same extent in other areas of China. Also, the labor element is much intensified in Xinjiang. 90,000 people hired to work in the security system. So that means that there's a sort of standing reserve of data police, of intelligence workers that can be put to work. Xinjiang is a police state to a significant degree. The level of policing is similar to that of East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Other places in China, there is also a significant police presence, but it's not at that level. The ideological fervor of the counterterrorism campaign that's being built through the regular meetings and the forms of discipline that are associated with those meetings, the coercion, is also something that's absent in other places in China. And so unless those things move to other places, it's unlikely that we'll see similar systems in place. Underpinning all of this is the camp system. Everyone's afraid of being sent to the camps in Xinjiang. That's not to say that there aren't areas in China or the larger sort of China sphere that shouldn't, where these systems could begin to emerge. And I'm thinking here about Hong Kong or Tibet. Those are locations where we could see similar things in the future. These things are also moving to other locations outside of China, and something that Sheena will talk about to a greater extent. But my sense is that for the most part, they're not being used to transform populations in those places. Instead, they're being used for deterrence, to prevent crime, and sometimes to investigate crime. And they're also being used to target political rivals, things like that. But less about sort of support for a colonial regime, which is really what's in place in Xinjiang. The broader implications beyond this is that technology, as I'm seeing it here, is really beginning to lead the policing, and it's beginning to sort of create its own reality. It means ignoring all of the noise that doesn't fit into the parameters of the system. They're really just looking at actionable intelligence, and so things that don't meet those parameters is just sort of pushed to the side. And there's one really interesting report that talks about how don't report children playing in the streets. Don't talk about conflicts between Han people. You should really just be focusing on the Muslims. And so there's a kind of blindness to the system that is ignoring an entire, the majority of the population in the city. And instead, what it's doing is criminalizing normative social behavior and social institutions of disfavored, illegalized populations. This process is normalized by the sort of black box effect of the technology system, where the technicians are simply looking at the parameters of the system and really not able to think critically about whether or not what the system is telling them is right or wrong. It's also standardizing and normalizing a kind of operational procedure. When it's combined with a reserve of data police, of racialized ideology and authoritarian statecraft, these forms of technology can produce forms of cruelty that transcend scale. So they move from the micro to the macro, back to the micro. And so it becomes a sort of feedback loop that creates its own reality. So the broadest level response to all of this should be that technology-led policing should be questioned. It's something that we shouldn't assume is going to sort of solve problems around policing. Policymakers should instead look for community-led policing. We should be questioning what sort of policing do ethno-racialized populations actually want? What's in their best interest? What kind of policing do Uyghurs want? Of course, getting China to ask that question is a difficult one. And so I think prior to that, we needed more of a tactical response where we would build a sort of multilateral global legal instrument to begin to regulate harmful forms of technology, especially things related to face recognition, to voice recognition, to forms of automated Islamophobia, which is basically what the system in Xinjiang is built to do. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions as we move through the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Darren. We'll now turn to Alex Dukalskis.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much. Thanks again also to the Wilson Center, to Lucas and Abe for organizing all of this, and to the Carnegie Corporation for funding all this research and allowing it to happen. As Chuck mentioned, my name is Alex Dukalskis. I'm at University College Dublin. I'm going to talk about my project called Paying for Propaganda, a preliminary study on the effectiveness of Beijing's advertorial inserts. So if you've ever been reading The Economist or The Washington Post and come across the China Watch supplement or the Beijing Review insert, then you've seen a pro-Beijing advertorial. Okay? Indeed, in the 2018 midterm elections in the United States, the practice briefly became a national political issue as the China Daily, which is a government-controlled newspaper, placed a 4-page supplement in Iowa's Des Moines Register targeting the state's farmers amidst the US-China trade war. Sometimes these are called paid advertising inserts or native advertising. I'll just use the term advertorials. A 2018 journalistic investigation by Louisa Lim and Julia Bergen found that Chinese government entities place advertorials in dozens of countries around the world, often in major newspapers or in flagship papers of smaller countries like my adopted hometown paper, the Irish Times. Many outlets have stopped doing this kind of their own accord, but many still continue to do so. Okay? Basically, advertorials are designed to replicate the look and feel of a genuine news article, but with a label indicating that they are paid for or sponsored content. And the details of that label kind of vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So the basic question motivating this research is whether advertorials work. Do they change the way readers think about China? I think many of us assume that they're basically a waste of money because they're so easily kind of seen as propaganda. But look, they continue to be used. So I think it's just worth asking the question, or at least trying to ask the question and answer, do they work? Are they effective in any way? Okay. There are lots of ways to come at that question. I'll explain more about how I aim to answer that question and what I found. But first, let me just give a couple points of background and context. The first point is that the Chinese government has long been concerned with how it's perceived abroad. Right? This is not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. It became especially salient from the 1990s onward, in other words, after the repression at Tiananmen Square. The basic idea was that, or the basic thinking was that if China was to rise without encountering significant pushback, it needed to tell a non-threatening story about itself, right? It needed to massage its image abroad, okay? We saw a scaling up in 2007 and 2008. External propaganda efforts were intensified and backed with more investment and more attention. Xi Jinping built on this foundation, emphasizing in a major 2013 speech that the party and its media should tell a good Chinese story, promote China's views internationally, and should in particular spread new ideas and new perspectives among developing states. So the result of all of this kind of for the end user has been external propaganda products and streams with greater reach and a sleeker appearance, a more kind of professional appearance than previously. So that's the first point, okay? The second point is that given the attention and money devoted by the CCP to its external propaganda efforts, the persistent presence of advertorials seems kind of puzzling, right? Advertorials seem like a crude propaganda device, unfit for a very sophisticated global information strategy, and yet they continue to be used. Okay? In the US, filings with the US Department of Justice pursuant to the Foreign Agents Registration Act reveal that China Daily Distribution Corporation has spent millions every year in the United States on advertising in mainstream newspapers. Again, many of these outlets have stopped in the last year or so, but globally, this isn't just done in the United States, this is done globally. So what is in the advertorials? Well, not surprisingly, the content is positive and uncritically upbeat information about China. Okay? The 2020 end of year issue of the Beijing Review, which is one of the common advertorial inserts that's used, features a list of China's top 10 news stories from 2020. Things like a decisive victory against COVID, eradicating extreme poverty, new development plans, new civil codes, advances in the space program, and so on, right? All positive stories about how the country is developing and moving forward. But advertorial content also appears to mirror the strategy apparent in Xinhua, the main news agency, namely to adjust its messaging for regional audiences. It's not just one message that goes out globally. The Beijing Review, for example, is available in English, French, German, Japanese, and Chinese. And reflecting the importance of burnishing China's image in Africa, it also has a dedicated China-Africa edition. Okay, so given all this, I kind of wanted to know if advertorials are effective. Okay? So to find out, I set up a survey experiment in Malaysia and Myanmar. Happy to talk more details about why those cases if you want, but I won't review all that here. But the basic idea was to compare two relatively similar contexts, both of which have seen this advertorial strategy used in the public sphere. Okay? And again, I'm happy to talk more specifics if you'd like, but the basic idea of the experiment was in each country, I asked 200 respondents to read some material and to take a survey. In each country, respondents were randomly assigned into one of two groups, a control group or a treatment group. In the control group, the participants read a selection of news articles about local, national, and regional issues, just normal news articles. They then took a survey about their political attitudes in general, their attitudes towards China, the United States, other regional states, and so on. Okay? It was a 16-question survey with some demographic information. So that was the control group. The treatment group read the same articles, but with an advertorial inserted into their reading material. Okay? They then answered the same set of questions. In the Myanmar experiment, the insert was a translation of a China Daily article called Belt and Road Boosting Myanmar Development, which was about the Belt and Road in Myanmar. In Malaysia, it was a China Daily branded piece titled Southeast Asia Grateful for Chinese Help in Crisis that dwells at length about how China is helping Malaysia during the pandemic. What were the results? This is one of those cases, and something that I think was great in the Wilson Center program was that I had no predetermined results. I mean, I could think of reasons why there could be outcomes for really any outcome, but it was just a question that had been bothering me as I was finishing up my book that's coming out soon. Like, why continue these advertorials? And I wanted to know what the outcome was. So I really had no preconceived notion. The results of the survey experiment reveal that for treatment and control groups as a whole, writ large, there's really no discernible difference in participants' views about a host of questions involving Chinese politics or Chinese influence in their country. For example, at the aggregate level in these samples, there's no significant difference between viewing an advertorial and responses to questions like questions such as, generally speaking, the influence China has on our country is very good to very bad sort of range. Or generally speaking, China's Belt and Road Initiative is very positive for our country to very negative. So writ large, the effects are not very prominent. Right? Digging deeper, it appears as if being in the treatment group, i.e. being exposed to the advertorial, has a small moderating effect on perceptions of China for those who followed news and events closely. So in other words, close consumers of news seem to be the ones, if there is an effect, that were more susceptible to it. So in this experiment, participants were asked how closely they followed major news and events in foreign countries and the world, ranging from very little to very closely. This interaction between political awareness, exposure, and exposure to propaganda yielded some noteworthy findings. And in the academic literature on this, that's something that others have found as well. In Malaysia, in the treatment group, there's a relationship between following events closely and how positively one assesses China's influence. So for the treatment group, in other words, we see more positive assessments of China for close news followers, only if they're exposed to the treatments. But for control respondents, we see nothing. In Myanmar, in the control group, i.e. those not reading the advertorial, there's no effect for following events closely and how much influence China is perceived to have. However, in the treatment group, there is a link between following events closely and perceptions of the level of China's influence. So, take-home message, there's some evidence kind of at the margins that advertorials work with a sample of people who follow news and events closely. While these findings are interesting, their limitations should definitely be kept in mind. This is one experiment in 2 countries, with a relatively small number of participants, in the scheme of things. Furthermore, the main effects of the treatment on a host of questions are not significant, so I don't want to overstate this at all. It's really only if we consider the combination of political awareness and being exposed to an advertorial that we find effects. Even so, those effects are pretty minor, and we don't have evidence that those perceptions remain, after, over a long period of time. Despite these limitations, and again, without wishing to overstate the findings, the results are kind of suggestive of the logic behind the advertorial strategy. Advertorials are generally placed in agenda-setting outlets. Readers of the Washington Post or the Economist, again, although both have discontinued the practice subsequently, likely fall into the category of people who follow major events closely. This research suggests that there's a logic to getting advertorials in front of their eyes. Highly globally aware readers of these publications may feel themselves immune to such a crude tactic. They may view themselves as kind of too smart to be influenced by something like that. But the possibility exists anyway that they might be wrong. Again, I don't want to overstate the results. More research would be really useful, particularly in different contexts. We're asked to say something about policy recommendations. I'm happy to, in the discussion, talk about this more, especially from those who kind of know the policy world better than I do. But I'll offer 3 considerations. First, the findings are not strong enough or clear enough to justify any kind of extreme measures like banning the use of advertorials or anything like that. While it might be distasteful, I think banning them would likely backfire. Using the tools of authoritarianism to fight authoritarianism is fraught with pitfalls, and censoring advertisements, especially in the West, would probably feed arguments that the West is hypocritical and out to get China and these kinds of narratives. Okay? That's the first point. The second is it doesn't mean that the advertorial should be of no concern. This is a clear case of an authoritarian state using the protections of the liberal public sphere to advance an agenda designed to undermine that very sphere. Okay? In the US context, if advertorials run, they should be transparent on their labeling. Some outlets do better than others in this regard, but in general, the label should be large, clear, and easy to understand to be consistent with Federal Trade Commission guidelines on native advertising. Furthermore, the FTC might consider, if they haven't already, issuing specific guidance relevant to pro-government advertorials. On its website, the FTC provides easy to understand advice for businesses on advertising laws and ethics in the United States. There's advice on native advertising there and examples, lots of examples for analysis, but providing specific advice on pro-government advertorials might be useful, and that might include, in particular, guidance on labeling. Of course, this only affects advertorials run in the United States, but such guidance might act as a template of best practice for other jurisdictions, a sort of model. Lastly, the third point, advertorials are only the most blatant form of external propaganda in foreign media environments. CGTN, China Radio International, so on and so forth, are all part of a much larger external propaganda ecosystem in which advertorials are only really a very small part. The content generated by the operation of Xinhua, for example, often has kind of the stamp of approval of being a legitimate news source, even if analysis of its themes as a co-author, and I did recently in a piece in Journal of Democracy, suggests that Xinhua has a propaganda function insofar as its messages are adjusted to fit Beijing's preferred narratives. Increasing transparency in these kind of grayer areas of pro-government propaganda is a pressing concern for which there are few obvious strategies. Perhaps the best democracies can do is insist on protecting their own liberal sphere, standing up for their own values, defending the principle of independent journalism, and letting labeling of external propaganda and scrutiny of its aims and transparency mechanisms kind of do the work for them. And with that, I thank you and I look forward to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. And we'll go to our final panelist, Sheena Greitens.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just start my slides here. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about China's global surveillance exports and really pick up in some ways on, where Darren's work on the internal mechanics and human dimensions of the surveillance process left off. I want to thank the Wilson Center for giving us this chance both to do the research and to be able to present it to policymakers. I'm really grateful to everyone involved in that process. So what I want to talk about today is the increasing number of countries to which China has provided surveillance technology. And some work done over the course of the last year and a half or 2 years. I started tracking the places that China has sent surveillance and public security technology platforms. So in other words, the number of countries in the international system that are adopting platforms is a little bit different than just buying hardware. It's not just buying facial recognition in cameras. It's not just buying license plate scanners. It's actually also buying some sort of back-end system like the one that Darren described that's capable of taking data inputs from the scanner at the entryway to a mosque and matching it to other government records for use in policing and public security. And so the technology that we're talking about and looking at today specifically has to be used in policing and public security for it to show up in this graph or in this map, which is another figure that tracks the number of places that China had exported its surveillance technology as of the end of 2019. We're trying to continue to collect data, but the analysis here is really going to focus on what's happened through the end of 2019, simply because, as I'll explain in a minute, that's where we have a cutoff and we can actually look at both the causes and the effects of this technology. Right, we don't yet have the ability to measure what's happened with technology that's been introduced in January of 2021 or even toward the end of 2020. And so we stop at 2019 to try to get a sense of what's happened when we introduce that technology in these countries. What is the political effect? And so what I want to do today is just briefly go over what's driving the export of this technology and its adoption globally. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the effects. And the effects are kind of where I want to focus today, but I do think it's important to understand what's driving this. Some of what I'm about to say is probably a little bit different than when I've spoken or written about this previously, in part because we have 1 or 2 years of updated data. And so the results have changed a little bit in terms of both the drivers and now the effects that we're trying to measure. I should add that a lot of this work has been done in co-authorship with one of my former graduate students, Ed Goldring, who's a postdoc in Hong Kong now, and who has really done some terrific and cutting edge work in spatial econometrics to try to figure out how we define and map dynamics within these networks that we're seeing. And so, when we look at the full set of data that we have up till today, one of the things that emerges is by far the strongest predictor of a country's likelihood that it will adopt a Chinese surveillance technology platform is whether or not it counts as one of China's strategic partners. This is a list that's formally compiled, a designation that's formally made by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the PRC. And we put together a data set that pulled the various types of partnerships off their webpage. They are public information, but can be a little bit tricky to compile. And this holds, right, the association between being a strategic partner of China and the likelihood that you will pick up and start using Chinese surveillance technology holds whether or not you treat it as, is a country any kind of strategic partner, or people who know Chinese foreign policy know that there are about, a dozen different types of these strategic partnerships, and that there's a rough hierarchy to them. And so if you try to create an ordinal variable that captures the fact that some partnerships are more important than others, the finding still holds that this is a really significant predictor of the likelihood that a country will adopt and keep a Chinese surveillance technology platform. And so what that means is that in the international community, right, the network of countries that are using this technology really does overlay with the network of China's strategic partners in the world. And I think that's important for the United States to understand and think about. But also there is some evidence of what we find is that there's some evidence of geographic diffusion, meaning that once a country in a region adopts and starts using Chinese surveillance technology, there appears to be a demonstration effect, and other countries then start to emulate their neighbors in terms of the use of this technology. And so that actually suggests that there's probably a demand side story at work as well, right? Because if introducing this technology within a region makes it more likely that that country's neighbors will pick up that technology, that may mean that they're seeing something or that they're intrigued by the promises that are being made about this technology, and therefore that makes them more willing than they were before to try it out as well. Interestingly, this is not the story about who adopts Chinese surveillance technology is not really a story about democracy. Both democracies and autocracies have adopted and used this technology. It's actually not really a story about crime, which is an important shift as we've seen the updated and fuller universe of data. In the earlier years, it was if you had a high homicide rate, you were a little bit more likely to adopt Chinese surveillance technology. But at this point, with the number of countries that have adopted now, that's actually not as true as it used to be. It's also not a story about state capacity or financial capacity, which distinguishes the diffusion of surveillance technology from, example, the diffusion of major military innovations. So surveillance technology is different from other types of security technology that scholars have previously examined. Now, here's where I think this gets interesting and important in terms of the stakes for the United States and for the international community. There's some very tentative evidence that this may have an impact. Introducing this technology may have an impact on crime rates in autocracies. Given the way that crime is defined in a number of autocracies, I'm hesitant to draw a lot of conclusions from that, and the findings not particularly significant or robust. But importantly, there is no significant reduction in crime rates after you adopt or start using this technology in a democracy. And that's important because that's essentially the biggest marketing tool that China has used to sell this technology in places like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and a lot of places around the world, is that this is really a public safety tool. And what we find is that if it's a public safety tool, it doesn't seem to work very well. And we think that's important for people to understand. It's also important to understand because there is a very clear negative effect on the levels of repression that exist in a country. And this is a little bit tricky. We had to find a measure of repression that was different from surveillance, right? So you can't really, it's sort of circular to measure the impact of surveillance on surveillance, right? So, but what we also find is that the introduction of a surveillance technology has a pretty clear negative impact on other forms of repression and political violence. And so, Darren mentioned earlier, that the biggest difference is that in many cases, this technology is not being used to identify people and send them to detention facilities and on anything close to the scale that it's being used in Xinjiang, right? And that is accurate, right? The connection between this type of technology and the administration of the camp system and the scale of detention and human rights abuses that we're seeing in Xinjiang is very, very different. But it is also pretty clear, and the finding is relatively robust, that this technology does negatively impact human rights and levels of repression in countries around the world. Interestingly, it has a much more limited impact on broader levels of democracy, largely because those levels of democracy are based on institutions. Right? And we wouldn't necessarily expect surveillance to, for example, change the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch, or, necessarily alter electoral procedures. But it doesn't necessarily affect democratic institutions or have to affect democratic institutions, but it does produce this clear negative effect in terms of human rights and repression. And we think that's a really important thing to now be clear about. This was always one of the big mysteries of Chinese technology, is what is the impact? Does it work for crime prevention? And does it have real political side effects? And we find that it doesn't work for the purpose that it's often being marketed for, and it does tend to facilitate repression and human rights abuse. So I think there are a couple of clear policy implications from this. One is just that I don't think we've had a good measure before where we were able to show a clear statistical association between the impact of this technology and increases in political repression. And now we do. It's also, this gives us a chance to try to assess the upside that is often argued for, right? And this is an argument that is made by both the Chinese tech companies that are providing this technology, but also by the mayors and the provincial officials, that this is why they're adopting the technology, because they feel a need to increase public safety, because that will also help attract investment and boost economic growth. And right, in many of these cases, this is a legitimate objective for a mayor or a provincial governor to have. The problem is that, at least according to our findings, it's not very likely to produce the desired effect. And we want people to be able to know that when they're assessing the cost-benefit trade-off of this technology. In terms of direct policy implications, I think there are two other things that are important to think about. De-adoption is not very common. Almost no country that's adopted a Chinese surveillance technology platform like this has pulled it completely out. And so if that's the case, right, if de-adoption is not common and these are the effects, then what this suggests is that democracies could really fruitfully focus on a sort of secondary layer of policy, where if you can't pull the system out for cost or political or other reasons, then in the meantime, there are a lot of institutional, legal, and technical mechanisms that could be put in place to sort of firewall the system from corroding or having a damaging effect on broader democracy and human rights. And the push in the United States to date has really been about trying to get countries to de-adopt this technology. But I'm not sure how realistic that is. And I really think even if that is the ideal goal, that we need to also talk about a secondary, more realistic goal, which is, if you have a system like this, how do you protect democracy under these conditions? And then the final point, which doesn't come directly from this research, but some other work that I've been doing on surveillance in 2020 and 2021, which the Wilson Center has generously allowed me to incorporate in this project instead of doing some of the archival research that I had originally planned on, is that we have models actually from the COVID-19 experience where democracies have used health surveillance, but have put in place these institutional and technical firewalls such that the technology has either been more compatible with, or at least a little bit less threatening to democracy. It's made the use of surveillance more proportional. It has been arrived at through a process of democratic consultation, often legislative debate and judicial review, and sort of popular accountability, therefore it becomes less of a threat, if that's what I mean by putting in place these institutional and legal safeguards that allow us to check the way that this technology is used and whether or not it is sort of a deeper and more fundamental threat to democracy around the world. And so I think that we have an imperative now to start having these conversations about in an age where this technology is widespread, what does it mean then to try to promote, protect, and sustain democracy in places where this technology has already been introduced? And then what does it mean for places that might be considering introducing it? And I would really like to see US policy kind of disaggregate countries and partners around the world and have these conversations on that more nuanced and disaggregated basis. I will stop there, but thank you so much, and really looking forward to the panel's questions and comments.
Okay, great. Thank you, Darren, Alex, and Sheena. You made my job easy. You all stayed well within the allotted time, so thank you. As a reminder, we can take questions from the audience through Twitter. So if you want to submit a question through Twitter, please tag at program, or you can send an email to us at asia@wilsoncenter.org. And please be sure to include your name and institutional affiliation. Before I sort of open it up to audience questions or some of the questions I myself have, I do want to give the three of you the opportunity to ask any questions you may have for each other. So if any of you have questions for one another, please. Sheena, go right ahead, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Darren, because I find his work, just really fascinating. And I wanted to ask about something that has shown up in some work that I've done on bureaucracy and information management in places that are not Xinjiang, right? Which is more the urban East. And the idea of, community grid management and what happens when you try to introduce a system like this. And one of the things that that we've seen in some work, again, based on China's East Coast, and this is also 5 or 10 years ago, is that when a lot of these systems were introduced, it produced a problem where everybody wanted their own tech infrastructure and their own tech systems. And so Li Keqiang has called this the problem of information islands, right? We hear about the Maoists, the idea that the masses need to be the eyes of the party, or social eyes and ears. But that's really a collection issue, right? And then there's the second issue of information integration. And I wondered if the police files in Xinjiang, how much of a problem is information siloing and information fragmentation, and kind of struggles for control of the data, and how is it integrated and put together to actually then be used? You kind of touched on that a number of places through your remarks, but I just wanted to ask you how fragmented is it? And is this a place where information islands are a problem, or have they basically sort of solved that in Xinjiang? Because that would be notable compared to what I've seen on the East Coast.
Well, that's a great question. So my sense is that the integrated joint operations platform, which is the sort of the highest level data collection system that's meant to integrate all these information flows, is something that's serviced by CETC, the China Electronics Technology Corporation. That's the parent company for Hikvision or Hikvision. That is really starting to pull this stuff together. Unfortunately, the police files don't really tell us, which companies are in charge of, which part of the system for the most part. Although they talk about some of the companies or apps that are targeted by the system, like Kwaya, for instance, which is an airdrop kind of tool that lets people share files. One of the things that's interesting, though, is how they talked about training the sort of intelligence workers or the community workers in collecting data. They said that if you collect data on things that are not pertinent to counterterrorism, like on noise complaints or children urinating in the elevator, or people running in the streets, or or like a construction site dispute between like Han migrant workers, like that doesn't help us integrate the system, and it's something that takes a lot of work to sort of push to the side, because it's actually adding noise to the system. And so I think that there's a kind of training process that's in place to instruct the low-level workers to collect the right kinds of data, to code it properly. They also talk about you have to make sure that the person's name is written correctly in Mandarin. They're talking about Uyghurs mostly, and also that the ID numbers are every number is filled out. So there's data collection issues that they're talking about that won't make that will cause noise in the system. That's pretty much the extent of what I know from how that they're thinking about it. The coercion aspect of it, where they're telling these low-level police, and many of them are Uyghur and Kazakh, to do this work correctly, is, I think, an element in it. I know this from interviews with those low-level police, that they talked about knowing that they could also be detained if they didn't follow the rules as they were supposed to. And so I think that is an element that's missing in other places in Eastern China. I think the integrated joint operations platform is unique to Xinjiang as well. So there's the coercion and also that integration point that I think is emphasized to a greater extent.
Great. We do have a question for Alex Dukalskis, and it comes from they remain anonymous, but they ask, is there a useful academic or policy distinction to be made between, quote, propaganda and, quote, public diplomacy? Or is it just that it's propaganda if it's designed by another country, and public diplomacy if it's designed by one's own country?
Yeah, I mean, it's fraught to ask an academic a definitional question, because we could be here for a very long time. Public diplomacy generally is thought of as kind of people-to-people type exchanges and programs that kind of bring populations together. So that's kind of somehow related, but a little bit distinct. About propaganda, I mean, I would say a couple things. One is that there, again, tons of definitional debates about this, but one element of it is some kind of ulterior, I guess you could say ulterior motive, right? Some way to justify or to propagate the sender of the messages, right? And that differs, I think, from independent journalism, where you could say there are biases in independent journalist outlets or whatever, but the kind of aim is not usually to propagate the viewpoints of the party. The other thing I would say is that China calls it propaganda, so that's what it is, right?
Thank you. This question goes back to the opening session just a little bit ago, and I think it's something that either Sheena or Darren could address. But it is debated or discussed whether what's going on in Xinjiang today does constitute genocide. And if we could just get one or both of you to comment on that and explain your position on that question. Either or.
I was going to defer to Darren as the true Xinjiang expert, and then I'm happy to follow.
Okay, I'll go first. I know you have some things to say, so I was waiting for you. Well, I think we have to understand the definitions of genocide in order to really make that claim or to assess that claim. Most people's idea when it comes to the idea or image that springs to people's mind when they hear that word is mass death. People are being killed intentionally. They're usually an ethno-racial minority of some sort, disfavored population. And if that's the standard that we're looking at, then I think we don't have the evidence that there's mass killing of Uyghurs. But if you look more closely at the definitions as they're defined in the 40s, it's about destroying a people. And it's talking about destroying a way of life, a cultural system. And so in that sense, what we are seeing is the social institutions ranging from religion, education, even finance, all being targeted by this system. And then we're also seeing the lower level institutions like family structure, language. We're seeing a kind of eugenics program where they're targeting women with forms of birth control and sterilization. We're seeing a real drop in actual reproduction in the population. And so there we're getting closer to something that does meet those definitions of genocide. As a scholar of sort of social systems and social forces and thinking about them as something that's historically driven and materially driven, I like to think about genocide as part of a larger sort of colonial system that is part of a larger process rather than as a kind of event. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't like to start with the term genocide, but instead sort of define it and bring it into conversation. I think many of the advocates that are talking about genocide in this context now are really doing it for the kind of tactical or strategic reason, which is they want to pursue forms of kind of criminal, a kind of criminal investigation of the system for the ICC and other places. And so from that perspective, it makes sense that you would think in those terms. So that means maybe kind of a Weasley sort of academic-y answer, but I think that's how we need to think about this, is that there's pros and cons in talking about it. It can seem as though we're sensationalizing what's happening, but at the same time, it has these benefits. I mean, already we're seeing that Uyghurs are better protected in the world if this term is associated with what's happening to them. Refugee status, asylum claims are made much stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I'm mindful of Alex's comment earlier that if you ask a bunch of academics a definitional question, we could be here all day and not necessarily have reached a useful sort of point by the end of this for policy purposes. And I guess, I would add a couple of things. I'm not an international lawyer, right? And so the question is whether or not what's happening meets the definition laid out under the Genocide Convention. And so, I guess I find the debates over definitions a little bit frustrating because they often impose these really false binaries that I think are unhelpful for having a productive conversation about what we do, which I think is usually the important question here. So I think Darren's laid out, what about China's behavior in Xinjiang is so incredibly disturbing. And I would just add that the report that was published by the BBC yesterday about gender-based violence, rape, and torture, particularly against Uyghur women who are detained, is particularly troubling reading on human rights grounds. And that it seems to me relatively clear that the term crimes against humanity is appropriate. Again, there's a convention for that, the Rome Statute that lays out the definitional standpoint. What I would like to see, because the counterpoint, right, then from China is, well, no, it's not, it's counterterrorism, and you get into, I think, again, like a really unhelpful false binary that doesn't get policy anywhere. I actually think that it would be productive for the international community to consider some kind of commission of inquiry, like the one that was done in North Korea, where similarly serious allegations were being made. That process wasn't led or administered by the United States. It was a truly international panel that concluded that crimes against humanity without parallel in the contemporary world were being committed on the Korean Peninsula by the government of North Korea. And that gave a really important international credibility and legitimacy to the witnesses and the victims of those acts. And I wish it was, I'm not optimistic that that's politically possible in this day and age, but that's the process that I would like to see, because it gets past the US said, China said kind of stuff that I just don't think gets us anywhere in policy terms, and most importantly, doesn't have an impact on the human beings whose lives are being upended and disfigured by what's going on in Xinjiang. I guess there's a couple of other thoughts. I mean, the statement this morning was something like that it wasn't genocide because Jiang Zemin had defined it as counterterrorism. And I guess I would take issue with that in I think maybe three different ways. One is that Xi Jinping is not Jiang Zemin. And he's particularly not when it comes to internal and external security. That's crystal clear. And so I don't think it's fair to assume continuity, right? That's an analytical question with plenty of counter evidence, right? And so I think that's a flawed analytical basis for trying to make the determination. The other one that I've already mentioned is the idea that there is a counterterrorism logic does not rule out genocide as a result. Most mass political violence is framed around some sense of articulated threat by a regime or a state. What matters is the utter disproportionality of the response that's occurring in Xinjiang and the violation of inviolable rights in the process of that response. And then the final point is that war doesn't look the same way that it did in the 1940s. And Darren's whole project is documenting how technologies of control and internal political violence are different as well. So I'm not sure, the idea that somehow a form of political violence has to look exactly like it did in the 1940s to count or to meet a conceptual definition doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So I guess, I think we need to have all of this in mind when we talk about it. But ultimately, to me, the question is much less about what label you put on it than we understand that horrific things are going on. What can and should be done about it, right? And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of a commission of inquiry as a starting point, because I think it would clear up some of this really unhelpful definitional stuff. And move us to the much more important, both strategic and moral question, which is it's crystal clear that incredibly widespread human rights abuses on a massive scale are occurring. What can and should be done about it? And I really wish that we would focus on that rather than the definitions. But I'll get off my soapbox now. Sorry to have answered in a long form.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from an audience member, and I apologize if I mispronounce their name. It's Ida Lee Dukalskis, and it concerns some of the racial biases, I guess, that could be built into facial recognition software. You know, in the United States, we've heard about how police using facial recognition on African Americans, for example, they oftentimes will find the wrong person. And so their question concerns this in the Chinese context, given the diversity of China and how this technology is being used against Uyghurs and other minority groups. And that could be for Sheena or Darren, I believe.
I'm happy to go first on this one and just say that I think that is pretty well documented, that there are, you know, racial and ethnic disparities in the performance of this technology. I think we tend to overestimate the omniscience of it generally, but I do think it's important to keep in mind the inequalities of performance across different ethnic groups, and that there really is. That really does then have differential consequences in a place like Xinjiang. The problem here also, though, is that, you know, as I think about, and I've been reading a book by my UT colleague, Sarah Brain, who talks about the use of, you know, big data policing and you know, sophisticated technology by police departments in the United States. The difference is that in a democracy, right, we get to openly debate and set and talk about what our tolerance for false negatives and false positives is. And China's is a system that has an extraordinarily high tolerance for false positives, and really not a lot of concern for the collateral damage, right? Explicitly, you would rather, you know, err on the side of imprisoning someone and preventing them from engaging in politically problematic behavior, rather than miss one person whose thinking is aberrant. And you get this metaphor of vaccination and immunization, right? Which by definition points out that you don't immunize people after they're exposed to a virus. You don't immunize people after they have a quote unquote political virus. You immunize them before they're exposed and in contact, which by definition, again, means that you are applying that treatment to people who have not necessarily done a lot that would be considered, to use the metaphor, politically symptomatic. So I think it's really important to remember that it's not just that the technology has biases, but it's that combined with the acceptance and willingness to have a very high false positive rate that becomes, you know, a really tricky and problematic ethical issue.
I can just add really quickly that most of the what they call national champion, AI national champions in China, which are companies like Mugvi or Hikvision or Dahua, the big camera companies and software companies that are doing face recognition, they have developed what they call like a Uyghur alarm. That's been pretty well documented now, which means that they're trying to automate the detection of Uyghur faces. In some cases, there's also Tibetans and Kazakhs, really looking at the phenotypes of the person's face, you know, the shape of their eyes and their nose. Paul Moser has shown in his analysis of a company called CloudWalk, Paul Moser is a tech reporter for the New York Times, that they have a 30% success rate, or that's what CloudWalk was saying at least at one point. So there's lots and lots of false positives in that system, where it's actually doing analysis in real time of people walking through high traffic areas. I think in Xinjiang itself, there's probably less false positives, and that's because they're working from a more symmetrical data set, a baseline data set, because they've collected, you know, high resolution images from everyone. In most cases, they've collected iris scans as well, voice signatures. You know, this is part of the Physicals for All data collection program, and so they have this really unprecedented data set to start with. And then on top of that, they're also monitoring people's movement using checkpoints, where they are you know, using the person's ID, image on their ID, and matching it to their face. They're also matching, oftentimes, at least some of the checkpoints, their the MAC address of their phone and SIM card to the person that's carrying the ID. So there's all these different identifiers that are being used to locate people in time and place. That means that I think the system is more accurate than it might be in other places in China where they don't have that checkpoint system. They don't have the symmetrical data set to start with.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Alex, and something you often hear now in terms of China's external propaganda is that basically it very much has sort of a, although they're targeting foreign audiences, it really is meant for a domestic audience. And oftentimes you hear, the audience of one, Xi Jinping. So I'm wondering if does it matter if these advertorials are effective or not effective if they're ultimately meant for domestic, purposes?
Yeah, I'll come to that. I want to just also address, kind of link this to the Xinjiang issue, which is to say that there's an external propaganda element to the Xinjiang issue as well, right? That's reliant, I think, on kind of a twofold approach. One is to lock down information as much as possible from the region. The fact that Darren has to use leaked documents, right, is a testament to that, and probably can't go do interviews and things like this. So there's a kind of a foundation built of denying information on which the state can then build its own arguments. And you can trace the arguments over time in the last few years. It kind of went from denial to, well, then those are schools, not camps, really, to, yes, well, okay, we are doing those things, but it's counterterrorism, so it's all okay, to, well, the US, you do bad things too, so, who are you to lecture us? You can see all those narratives play out, right? And I think it does have an effect in terms of at least putting those things into the public discourse and muddying the waters at the very least. Okay? So coming to your point, this is one that I hear a lot, and it might very well be that that advertorials are to please your bosses, right? But then just, I guess the bosses think they work somehow, right? The argument, I think that that you often hear this argument in the context of kind of the wolf warrior sort of diplomacy, where they're trying to show themselves to be tough, standing up to particularly the West. I guess I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. This is impressionistic, but but I think there's a dual approach of kind of standing up to the West, but then also cultivating a softer image in the developing world to be a leader of kind of a global South bloc of countries. And so I think you can simultaneously achieve that goal and also please your boss by by taking a more aggressive stand on external propaganda.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from one of the other members of the China Fellowship class, and that's Cecilia Hahn-Springer. And she asked, does surveillance technology include web-based monitoring and censorship? How does China export these, quote, soft technologies that are less physical equipment and more of a set of techniques and approaches to governing the internet? Are other countries emulating China's model of internet sovereignty?
That's a great question, and to be honest, I don't. That's not the facet of surveillance that I looked at. We tried to adopt a pretty narrow definition with a relatively high bar, but there's been work by Steve Goldstein and others that looks at the proliferation of other Chinese surveillance affiliated technologies. Again, we picked one that was relatively complex so that whatever estimates we were giving people was if anything conservative. And I think if you looked at hardware and other forms of surveillance, you'd probably find slightly different patterns and maybe even broader distribution in the international system. I don't know the answer specifically with respect to internet surveillance. What I will say is that Based on some data that I'm working on collecting now, it looks like China has generally upped its law enforcement collaboration around the world, and the Ministry of Public Security's International Cooperation Department has overall become more active. So to the extent that they are, a key actor involved in sharing lessons and training people around the world, we may be seeing some increase in activity, but I actually don't know of a great piece that tracks how much China's cyber sovereignty and sort of its approach to data security, which I think Wang Yi premiered last year sometime as sort of a big foreign policy initiative. It's not clear to me exactly who signed on to that and whether the rhetorical sign on is meaningful in practice, but it would be a great area to see somebody work on in the future.
Thank you. We've got what could be sort of a big question for Darren, and it's a simple question, but it's a big question, and it's, can you see China changing course in its policy in Xinjiang in the near to midterm, or is this, are they set on this path?
And that is a great question, and I don't have a great response or answer. But I can give one. We've already seen some changes from the Chinese state that I think is responding, at least in part, to international pressure. Them first denying that the camps exist and then saying they do, and then eventually that everyone has graduated, I think is a response to international pressure. Most of what that was an obfuscation of what was going on the ground. But there was some actual results. Some folks that, especially elderly people and people in poor health, I think have been released, especially if they've been seen as less of a threat. And I should use released in quotes or scare quotes of some sort, because really what that means is they've been placed on a kind of neighborhood arrest where they're still being watched. They're still on the watch list, and they will be for at least some time. So they're still in some form of confinement. The state talks about the system as a long-term strategy, that this is something that will last a generation. I think they're thinking that the next generation of Uyghurs will be the generation that will be fully transformed or re-educated, because they'll be raised inside the sort of boarding school, residential school system. And so I think they're thinking that the adult population has to kind of be held in confinement for a long period of time. Some of that looks like factory work. So a lot of people are being placed in forms of unfree labor inside the region, and in some cases outside of the region. Many of those people are not even people that were in the camps, but were deemed surplus laborers. They're farmers, and are now being sent to work in factories. And part of what that does is it produces family separation. And so I think that's actually a major factor in why we're seeing a drop in birth rates, is because families have just been separated from each other, family members. And so that's one of the major factors beyond the sterilizations and things like that. The other thing that's happened, and I think this is a significant story that should get more attention, is that large numbers of people that were previously in camps have been moved into forms of formal incarceration in prisons. We've seen a dramatic increase in the building of prisons. I wrote a piece for China File recently about a city called Shawan, which is in northern Xinjiang, where in 2019 they built a brand new prison. It's a medium to maximum security prison that's very disproportionate to the size of the town. And that's something that we're seeing in many locations around Xinjiang, is just these immense prisons that are being built. Oftentimes there's a sort of workhouse associated with that prison, so it becomes a factory labor, a factory prison sort of system. That's, I think, the long-term strategy, is to put these people to work in incarceration. I don't know what kind of pressure can be brought to bear on this. I think, there's still an information gap across China. Many regular folks don't even understand what's going on, or if they have some sense of it, they think it's justified. The development narrative that development is necessary and that Uyghurs are backward and that this is something that has to happen is very strong across China. And then it's combined with a kind of Islamophobia that's been institutionalized by the state. reversing that is going to take a lot of work, and it's very difficult because of the information blockade that Alex is talking about. There's some movement to, for instance, boycott the Olympics or to relocate the Olympics from China, the 2022 Olympics. That could have some effect in terms of messaging to the general public. And I think those are the sorts of things that would start to get the message across. Just to wrap this up, the genocide, naming that was done by Pompeo is something that was very quickly picked up in Xinjiang. Like, everyone knows that Pompeo said it's genocide now because they talked about it on national TV, and then they organized a campaign asking Uyghurs to say it's not genocide, and to publish those things online. So when something happens in the West, that it does have some effect, and many Uyghurs, I imagine, in Xinjiang are grateful that there's that kind of attention that's being paid to them, even though it also produces these political costs for them. So that's to say we shouldn't give up. I think we have a moral obligation to continue to raise awareness and take this into the mainstream.
Great. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I thought we'd ask a question that hopefully all three of you can speak to. And it's basically, sometimes you hear about this so-called China model, and you can imagine that in many different ways. It could be, China's propaganda model, China's surveillance technology model. But we speak of a China model, and is China, is that a useful terminology? And do you think China is attempting to export its model abroad? And again, that can be for all three of you, if you wish.
You want to start, Sheena?
Yeah, sure. I guess the debate about this often focuses on China's intent. And while that's relevant, it's not the only piece of information that I think is helpful or important. And so when I look at this, I see a range of intents, right? Chinese tech companies have an economic interest. They have an economic interest in getting this technology out so that their standards are supported and accepted in international organizations. And they have an interest in getting international organizations to accept these standards, which to increase the likelihood of future exports and market share. So I think there's a financial logic. I think a lot of this goes back to sort of the core way that Xi Jinping has chosen to introduce or to approach regime security in China, which seems quite frankly different than his predecessors in some fairly significant ways. I actually think a lot of China's behavior is more directed at protecting the CCP and keeping space for CCP objectives, survival and continued leadership and rule over China itself, than necessarily remaking the world in exactly its image, right? I think that it's more about making the world safe for the CCP than making the world safe for necessarily autocracy, or trying to turn the entire world into an autocracy like China. It's more about making sure that whatever forms of governance exist out there and international structures exist, allow the CCP to pursue its own key objectives, which really have to do with the maintenance of its rule and its control over Chinese society. So I guess that's the way I would put it. And I think that we'd probably be better off to sort of move away from this debate about what China's intent is, because it's such a large and complex system that I think intent is a multidimensional concept, and really focus on the impact, right? Because I think we now have some data on what the impact of China's behavior is, whether it's on human rights in the areas Darren is working on, or democracy and messaging about the success of autocracy like Alex is working on, or the export of surveillance. Right, we're really starting to get a much clearer ability to assess the impact of China's behavior. And I think we probably will have more success convincing other countries to share our concerns and come up with a joint plan of action if we're focused on something that's very clear and measurable, like impact, rather than on this much more nebulous and undefinable question of intent. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Great. Alex, it looked like you also had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I can pick up from there. Yeah, I mean, the intent question is an interesting one, and always the intent of political leaders is often, of course, very difficult to establish. I would say three things. One is I agree with the argument Sheena just made that there's no effort to kind of like this, create, little CCPs around the world, right? To create, export authoritarianism in that kind of direct, crude fashion. I would say, however, there is a clear effort to alter the norms and terms of reference for global discourse about how we talk about democracy and authoritarianism. That much is very clear to me in looking at the messaging of the government and some of the moves that China has made at the United Nations and the Human Rights Council and in the General Assembly and increasingly in the UN Security Council as well. So I think there's a clear effort to change the way we talk about different political systems and a clear effort to change the standards on which we judge them. Which has an effect in terms of whether something like a China model, if you want to put it that way, is an appropriate thing for a country to do, right? The second thing I would say is, judging from some analysis we did, co-author and I did of Xinhua, and drawing on some stuff from my book, there's a clear effort to undermine the image of liberal democracy. I don't think there's much question of that. There's a clear messaging if you analyze the kind of Xinhua messaging from a 30,000 foot perspective. Western democracies are routinely really disproportionately bad news is highlighted and attributed to that, and it's the standard narratives of kind of, if you want chaos and disorder, get yourself some democracy. And so I think there's a clear effort to alter the way we talk about those models. Again, that's not directly like implanting or imposing an authoritarian model on another country, but it does over time, I think, have some effects. The third and last thing I would say is that at least at the United Nations, and in terms of global governance, I mean, Xi Jinping himself talks about this pretty openly about, spreading Chinese wisdom, spreading China model. I don't think this is like a big secret, right? It's something that's talked about relatively openly. And let's be honest, I mean, the more effective that model looks, the more appealing it is to other leaders, right? And so there's clear incentives to propagate the success of that model externally. For all of those reasons, to alter the norms of discourse, to change the way we talk about democracy, and to have other political regimes, interlocutors be more friendly to your interests.
Okay, Darren, last word, 60 seconds or so.
Okay, just to talk for a second about how I see a China model development. When I think about global China, I often turn to the work of C.K. Lee, Qingquan Li. And what she shows in her work is that there's a sort of loose set of strategies, that there's economic investment in infrastructure. That's what the BRI is really focused on. And then there's also patron-client relations that are often developed between localities in China and officials in the receiving country. And then there's sometimes a transfer of symbolic and cultural power or knowledge. And I would say that in many cases, it's really, people are interested in the development, they're interested in the infrastructure, and the patron-client relations and the symbolic transfer is something that's more difficult to establish. Maybe Cambodia is an exception to that. When you turn on the TV in Cambodia, often what you'll see is Chinese language programming that's subtitled or voiced over in Khmer. And patron-client relations have been developed, infrastructure is being built. So that's the sort of model that I see spread in a global China environment. But I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of sovereignty that localities have, that other nations have, and ways of negotiating that. And so we're not seeing a kind of new empire or new colonial presence. even as China is developing in this global way.
All right, well, thank you, all of you, for taking the time to speak to our audience today. It was great to have you all as Wilson China Fellows this past year. And before closing, I would just like to remind our audience that the next panel of the conference will begin in about 30 minutes at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it will be moderated by Robert Daly, and the panel is on the subject of global norms, governance, and Chinese policymaking. So thanks again for tuning in, and thanks to Sheena, Alex, and Darren. This has been great.